Hi, friends. Our leadership team at Stanford has asked for a sort of more rapid update than the usual 2 weeks. So I'm going to update all of you a little bit earlier as well. The good news is that the interesting data is that we're stabilizing and moving in a downward trend versus the upward trend, which is great. So let me share my screen with all of you. So here you can see just the overview. Globally, we've possibly peaked, although I did tell you that about 2 weeks ago that we had peaked and then we came down and then jogged back up again. So we'll just have to wait and see and hope that this is continuing a downward trend. The hotspots continue to be the same areas. Cases in the US and California are definitely decreasing. Hospitalizations are decreasing in the US and perhaps have peaked or plateaued in California. Vaccination is kind of down low now at 0.96 million in the US, but 73% of Californians are now fully vaccinated with 2 doses, but mortality is unfortunately still rising in US and California. So to start with the variants, you can see again, Omicron is still over 99.9% of all cases. It's really pushed everything else out. And when you look at the geographical distribution, really you can only see a sliver of orange in some of these circles left over. And when you look at Santa Clara County, you can see that we've added some cases of Delta, but mostly adding cases of Omicron at this point. And as many of you may have read about in the news and in the media, BA.2 is a related variant of the original Omicron variant BA.1. And it's making headlines, although we've known about it and been watching it for a while now. It surfaced about the same time in South Africa as the original variant, but did not seem to be outperforming that variant. However, recently we have seen some trends in areas like Denmark and India where BA.2 is increasing in the population and the overall cases are also increasing. And I'll show you that a little bit more in detail. When you look at other news regarding Omicron, you can see that it can survive longer on plastic and skin compared to other variants. This is new information, a new study out of Japan, and this really seems to give another clue as to why this variant is much more contagious perhaps than prior variants. And then this is finally just some good information from the CDC, and you can see that when you look at this fully vaccinated with the additional booster dose, which is that bright blue line down low, you can see that's almost close to zero when you look at COVID-19 associated hospitalizations compared to the just slightly higher line where it's fully vaccinated without a booster. And of course, really high up there, the unvaccinated line. So having seen that, let's go right into vaccination. You can see that overall the US remains right where we have been in relation to other Western first world nations around the world, just above 60% of our overall population vaccinated. When you look at it broken down by age group, you can see over 200 million people fully vaccinated with 2 doses. That's 67% about of the age population over 5 and 88% of the age population over 65, which is great. But then when you look at booster doses, unfortunately, only 41% of the eligible population has received a booster dose at this point. So not doing as well there, and definitely an area that we can improve on. When you look at the administered doses per day, you can see that although there were some spikes in recent months, we're down again to about 0.96 million being administered per day. And you can see this covers both boosters as well as initial and second doses of the vaccine. When you look at overall states fully vaccinated, you can see that the Northeast region is again doing the best. California and New Mexico has made some good strides in the last 2 weeks. Wyoming, Mississippi, and Alabama still lag behind the rest of the nation. When you look at California daily vaccinations, there's some artifact in this graph. It's not clear why, but no data has really been collected for the last few days on this subject. When you look at vaccinated status by group, you can see that overall, again, we're doing quite well in California compared to the US at 73% fully vaccinated. But over age 65, we're actually not doing as well as the rest of the country with only 83% versus 88% fully vaccinated. When you look at Santa Clara County, however, we are doing well across the board. So 93.2% overall, just continuing to slowly inch up in these really high numbers that we already have. And thankfully, when you look at that booster dose, 63.5% of the population of our county that's eligible has received a booster. So doing better as far as that goes. And then, of course, in that age over 65 population, we're doing better than California and even better than the rest of the nation at 95% vaccinated. When you look at global cases in this far off end of the graph, like I told you at the beginning, it does look like there's a little bit of a decrease and perhaps we've peaked, but you can see that prior decrease and then we jogged up again. So we'll just continue to monitor this for you guys. When you look at overall hotspots, still have increasing numbers in many areas, but with a decelerating rate. And you can see that Canada has started to come down, Russia has come up a bit. So overall, pretty steady, but maybe overall decreasing. This is interesting to me where you see that the EU was decreasing nicely, but now has this sharp increase at the end of that line. And the EU tends to precede what happens in the US. And so we'll have to watch and see, does this also happen in the US? When you look at these selected countries, you can finally see that Israel, after its really sharp exponential rise up in cases, peaked and now is coming back down. Denmark, as I mentioned earlier, that's one of these countries that has this increasing share of the population getting sick from the BA.2 variant versus the initial Omicron variant. And you can see that that is sharply rising as well. So certainly an area to watch. And if you look down at the bottom, India, which has remained really flat for a long period of time now, is now also increasing in cases. And they also now have a majority of their share of cases showing the BA.2 variant. So definitely an interesting area to continue to watch here. When you look at cases nationally, thankfully you can see a really nice downward trend in cases in the US here. And when you look at overall the areas, it's really still hot almost everywhere except for Maine, which is our most highly vaccinated state. So I think that says a lot right there. And then as far as COVID-19 cases in California, thankfully we are also decreasing. We've had this drop in the last 2 weeks. And then in Santa Clara, we're also decreasing in cases. And in San Mateo, we are also decreasing in cases. At Stanford, when you look at just the student body, unfortunately, we have a little bit of a jog up this last week. You can see the week prior, it was 205, and now it's up a bit at 282, but still much further down from that 494, which is the number of cases we saw in the first week of January. So we'll have to continue to watch this. Hopefully it trends down again. Overall, the case positivity rate is 2%, which is still much better than Santa Clara at 15% and overall California at 20%. You can see that when we look at Stanford faculty, postdocs, and staff, we don't mirror that upward tick. We continue to nicely trend down, where we have 159 cases over the last week, which is down from 295 the week prior. So still doing well as far as that population. And when we start looking at the pediatric population, I think this is a really nice article that just came out in JAMA Pediatrics. 2 weeks ago, I told you guys about the data from the CDC, database data showing that there was an increasing trend in diabetes in the pediatric population that had been exposed to and tested positive for COVID-19. I think this is a really nice graph showing that similarly out of a group from UCSD, showing that incidence of new onset type 1 diabetes really taking off after the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. So certainly interesting information and something that we should be paying attention to as we move forward. When you look at the overall share of COVID-19 cases that the pediatric population makes up, we are at an all-time high at 25.5% of that population being kids. Really, there was a prior peak in mid-November at 20%. Really, up until August, it was only 14.6%. Thankfully, hospitalizations and mortality remain low in this group. When you look at overall hospitalizations in the US, you can see that that is decreasing. When you look at hospitalizations in California, perhaps we've peaked. There's a little bit of a peak or plateau at the end of our graph here. So hopefully this was the beginning of a downward trend. And then in Santa Clara specifically, there is a possible drop off in our peak where our numbers are down just a touch over the last few days in both hospitalizations and ICU cases. In San Mateo, there isn't a downward trend yet, and it doesn't really look like a peak. It's more just stable over the last several days. And when we look at San Francisco, I would say possibly we have peaked. So just a few days back, we were at an all-time high at 271, but now it's come down again to 263. So hopefully that continues a downward trend. When you look at mortality overall nationally, that continues to rise. And I think Bob Wachter made a really interesting point in one of his recent posts that shows, our total deaths now in this country are 877,815. And that is actually a number that is just higher than the overall total population of the city of San Francisco. So that entire population of people has died over the course of this pandemic. And so that is somewhat sobering to think about. When you look at overall mortality in California, unfortunately, that does continue to rise still. And when you look at Santa Clara County specifically, we're pretty stable in our mortality, 15 deaths over the last 2 weeks, and there were 17 deaths in the 2 weeks prior. Interesting news that came out in the LA Times. San Francisco is going to ease mask and vaccination proof rules as Omicron recedes. And so we'll see how that plays out and if it affects our case numbers or hospitalization rate at all. And then finally, I'll leave you with some interesting news in research looking at long-term COVID. There have been a lot of different methodologies put together in this paper coming out in Cell, showing that perhaps there are these 4 main categories of risk factors for developing long-term COVID. And this is interesting news because it really gives us some new targets to try to really treat people with long-term COVID symptoms. And so hopefully this will pave the way for new treatments and management options for these patients that are suffering further. So with that, I'll stop sharing. I hope that was all helpful and interesting for all of you. I hope you all stay safe and healthy, and I'll see you soon again. Bye-bye.